On June 13th, 1999, IGN posted two identical reviews, one for Pokémon Red version and one for Pokémon Blue version. They read like advertisements for the games and the franchise as a whole, and to be fair, that's what they are. Early video game journalism was mostly an opportunity for developers and publishers to advertise their product without worry of critical analysis or discussion of value. And this is definitely early. Check out this web design. IGN gave Red and Blue a 10 out of 10 rating, a masterpiece. But it's hard to argue with them.
These games were the West's introduction to what would become the single most profitable and arguably successful franchise of all time. Ask yourself, do you know anyone who hasn't at least heard of Pokémon? Probably not. Hi, I'm 2Dens, and I haven't played the original Pokémon Red or Blue versions for over 25 years. I wanted to re-experience the game while thinking critically about why and how design decisions were made. But most of this video is actually going to be a discussion of the game's difficulty. I did beat the game as a kid, but I remember it being very hard. If you've seen my Star Fox Adventures video, you know I was a bit of a dodo bird when I was younger. My recent playthrough had some light challenge, but it wasn't where I thought it would be. So I named myself 2Dens with Roman numerals because the game doesn't let me use numbers. I named my rival Dodo, and my journey began. It's a tale as old as time. A 10-year-old leaves home and travels the world on his own, slowly. Cave diving, exploring abandoned power plants, testing his luck at the casino, all while facing and capturing dangerous creatures, some of which are literal forces of nature. Along the way, he challenges gym leaders, fights off biker gangs, and single-handedly thwarts the mafia. You know, regular 10-year-old things. All this happens in the game, but it's not really strung together in the form of a narrative. It just kinda happens. You sorta stumble into it. Pokémon Red and Blue aren't known for an edge-of-your-seat story.
If you want an actual story, just read the Pokémon Adventures or Special manga. Seriously, it's so good. It's the best Pokémon media out there.
The game introduces new zones, Pokémon, items, moves, and key abilities in the form of HMs that unlock more of the world for you to explore, Metroidvania style. And they're all unique in their execution, and are actual moves your Mons can use in battle. I'm looking at you, Star Fox Adventures. This is the core gameplay loop, and it's all contained in a world with a very impressive scope for its time. Kanto is a large map for the Game Boy, and 151 Pokemon is a lot, all with unique sprites and move animations that are much more detailed than I remember. When I was a kid, I always thought the sprites in Red and Blue were low quality, especially compared to Yellow and future games. But playing it again, I'm honestly impressed with them as an adult. They have a remarkable amount of detail, despite the low pixel count, and they have so much character that was kinda lost by the time Yellow was released. Yes, even the back sprites. Let's take a look at Golbat, for example. The Red and Blue sprite has Golbat taunting you with a super long and gross tongue, all while staring into your soul with those skeevy eyes and doing a weird dance. But in Yellow, it's just swaying around. In Generation 2 and 3, it's at least doing a little dance, but by Generation 4, it's just hovering there. Sure, the sprites for Yellow and Forward are more accurate to the original Ken Sugimori art. But come on, the Red and Blue Golbat is just something else. And while not all sprites from the original games have an equal amount of clarity, they are better portrayals than people seem to remember. I even feel this way about the original Japanese red and green sprites as well, though some of those are a little bit wonky, to say the least.
Sorry, I got sidetracked, but while I'm at it, please consider subscribing if you've enjoyed this so far. While I'm going to touch on every notable event in this game, I'm going to jump around a bit, because it's easier to discuss the game's difficulty on the whole if we group similar challenges together, and the game's difficulty is very integral to how much of a masterpiece it is. Let's get to it.
For the remainder of the video, I'm going to be using the term answer a lot, which I define as a Pokemon that either resists or can learn a move that is super effective against a Pokemon in a specific named battle. These include gym leaders, rival battles, Giovanni, and the Elite Four. Simply due to the nature of Pokemon, the games give you an enormous amount of choice for any given playthrough, and the further in you get, the more choices there are. Those choices, however, are mostly hidden until Generation 8. It's the Pokemon, obviously. The most famous choice of the entire series is your starter for Generation 1, Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle. It's frequently thought of as an unofficial difficulty mode, with Bulbasaur being considered the easiest, Squirtle being in the middle, and Charmander being a hard mode for lack of a better term. There is some debate on this topic, but is it actually true at all? Kinda, but only up to the first gym, because beyond that, there are always answers to every challenge if you either know where to look or you explore. We'll get to that. For now, let's focus on the opening section of the game.
Jelly-filled are my favorite. Nothing beats a jelly-filled donut.
I played up through the first gym in Pewter City 3 times for this video, once for each starter. I'm going to start with Bulbasaur because this was my main playthrough, for which I used Blue version as that was the one I had as a kid. I wasn't intending to analyze Bulbasaur's difficulty at this point, so this opening is filled with distractions, catching Pokemon, talking to NPCs, seeking out items in Viridian Forest, etc. I had to get Bulbasaur to level 13 for Vine Whip, which wasn't a problem due to how slowly I chose to progress through this section. However, if I hadn't, it would have taken some grinding, but not much. Once Bulbasaur learned Vine Whip, it was a clean sweep. I'll talk about Squirtle next because it was arguably easier than Bulbasaur. I pretty much did a speedrun for this one, heading straight for Pewter Gym while fighting as few battles as possible. This is because I only needed to get to level 8 for Bubble. Just because of an unusually high encounter rate and unskippable trainers, I also beat the gym trainer even though I didn't have to. Squirtle was level 12 by the time I got to Brock, which led to another clean sweep. Charmander was a lot more interesting. It wasn't hard per se, but it could have been. Once again, I did a minor speedrun focusing solely on getting to Brock as quickly as possible with just a slight difference from Squirtle. I didn't avoid any battles or trainers. At level 9, Charmander learned Ember, which made Viridian Forest free. Everything, aside from the occasional Pikachu, was easily dispatched by Ember. This allowed Charmander to be level 14 by the time I reached Brock. Here's the thing, Brock was much easier with Charmander than I thought it would be. Geodude was easy. I spammed a couple growls, used one potion for safety, and spammed embers. Geodude didn't take a ton of damage from Ember, but it was more than I thought it would be. It got burned once, but Brock immediately used a full heal, rendering it null. Onyx was a bit trickier, but still ultimately pretty simple. It used Screech right away until Charmander's defense was at -6, so there was no playing around the crit. Instead, I had to play around Bide. When Bide was used, I would growl until the attack failed, after which I would spam Ember. Once again, I got a burn, but Brock used a full heal immediately. Onyx kept attempting Bide, which I believe was due to the AI seeing a kill with Bide despite the fact that Onyx also had Tackle and Bind. If Onyx had used either of those attacks, this would have been a far more difficult challenge. I don't know, maybe I got lucky. I whittled Onyx down with Ember, and that was that.
I want to be clear, this was easy, but it was also one of the more challenging single battles in my entire revisit of these games, and it took a lot of strategizing too compared to most battles.
Okay, Raichu, give it a thunderbolt.
The idea that your starter decision has a noticeable impact on the game's difficulty beyond Pewter City makes sense in theory, but in practice is a bit silly. Yes, Bulbasaur is going to have an advantage over Misty's Water-type Pokemon, and will be resistant against Lieutenant Surge's Electric types. Squirtle will be resistant to Misty's team, but will also be resisted, and it will be weak against Lieutenant Surge's. Charmander will be weak and resisted versus Misty's team, and won't have any good answers to Lieutenant Surge's. It makes sense, yes, but it focuses solely on the gym battles and ignores the rest of the game. There are answers available for every gym battle after Pewter City, and you don't have to look very hard to find them. Brock is special because, at least in Red and Blue, there isn't an immediate answer available if you pick Charmander, unless you want to level a Nidoran up to 43 so it learns Double Kick. But as I've already proven, you don't need an answer for Brock, and you don't actually need an answer for any other gym leader either. But it does make the game a lot easier, an intentional and brilliant choice by Game Freak, but we'll get to that. Struggling with Misty? Pick up a Pikachu from Viridian Forest or an Oddish or Bellsprout depending on which version you're playing on routes 24 or 25. Struggling with Lieutenant Surge? Pick up a Sandshrew from routes 5 or 6 as long as you're playing Blue, or a Diglett from Diglett's Cave. There are fire types available before Celadon City, but you could also just use a flying type for Erica. You'll have access to ghost type Pokemon before entering Saffron City, but uh-oh, there's a bug, and psychic types are immune to ghost type Pokemon instead of weak. Speaking of bugs, Bug types are strong against Psychic, but they are just so weak in Red and Blue to the point where they're irrelevant. For Fuchsia, you'll have access to a range of Ground and Psychic types, and by the time you're headed to Cinnabar and back to Viridian, you'll have access to Surf and a Great Rod, if they even matter at this point, which they honestly shouldn't. In fact, by the time I reached Vermilion City, I had all 6 of what would become my final team that I would use for the entire game, not once having to switch anything out. Let's briefly go through each of my gym battles. Misty was a bit more challenging due to the fact that I was leveling Magikarp, which requires starting with it in battle and switching out to deal damage with another Pokemon. My team was a bit low level due to the split XP, and I did try to start with Magikarp, but realized I needed to let it faint. Pikachu and Sandshrew were too low level to take more than one hit, so Ivysaur just had to wipe up. By the time I got to Lieutenant Surge, Sandshrew had evolved into Sandslash, and it was a clean sweep, not only for Surge himself, but the entire gym. Erica and the Celadon gym trainers were swept by Pidgeotto using Wing Attack. This is despite the fact that Pidgeotto got poisoned at one point and ended with very little health in the end. I had Kadabra in the back just in case, but never needed to switch. For the fighting gym... wait, does this one count? My Pokemon were pretty underleveled for this, but it didn't matter. Kadabra swept the entire gym. Sabrina was the only gym battle I was a little concerned about, simply because I didn't have any direct answers. She was certainly the most challenging gym leader, but it was still pretty easy. Despite still being underleveled at this point, my Pokemon just outscale whatever the game throws at me. Between solid coverage across the whole team, but especially Venusaur, Pidgeot, and Raichu, along with generally strong mons in Gyarados, Sandslash, and Kadabra, I was pretty much prepared for anything the game had coming. Some of the moves still had to be solidified, but that would happen in time. Koga's gym was clean swept by Kadabra, regardless of his team's very annoying moveset, and that of the rest of the gym for that matter. Blaine's gym was completely swept with a combination of Sandslash and Gyarados, and from this point on, my Pokemon were always underleveled for the rest of the game. Giovanni's gym had a lot of type diversity, so it required some switching around for resistances and move typing, but it was still very easy. If you build around finding answers for the gym leaders, you'll generally be prepared for the entire game. None of my gym battles were hard, per se, but they became increasingly more trivial as the game went on, with the sole exception of Sabrina. But the gyms aren't the only milestone challenges throughout the game. Let's talk about the rival battles.
Gary was here. Loser! Oh, that Gary!
The rival is a recurring set of battles in which the opposing team expands and gets stronger throughout the game. Dodo here was never difficult for me, but he could have been if I hadn't played the way I did. It turns out preparing for the gym battles also somewhat prepares you for the rival fights. The first battle in Oak's lab is just a tackle and scratch fest. Charmander used Growl over and over, so I'm pretty sure Bulbasaur was doing 1 damage at a time, but I used Growl a couple times as well, so it didn't matter. The second battle, well, you can accidentally skip it, and I did. Dodo would have added Pidgey to his team, so I don't think it would have been an issue. It takes place west of Viridian City. The third battle takes place in Cerulean City and has the potential to be hard, but it was easy for me. I wanted to use it to train some of my weaker Pokemon, but his Pidgeotto's Quick Attack and his Rattatas Hyper Fang were dangerous moves. I needed to focus on winning, which I did. I like that he used an Abra which only knows Teleport. They could have easily given it an attacking move, but they chose to keep it consistent, which I found to be a nice touch. The fourth battle is on the SS Anne, and at this point I had already started to scale. This fight is notorious for being a jump in difficulty due to his Kadabra, but I absolutely stomped the whole team. There was never even a concern of a Pokemon fainting. The fifth battle takes place in the Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town. Dodo's Raticate died, so he replaced them with Execute and Gyarados. Once again, I stomped this fight without issue. Gyarados is scary, but it just gets one-shot by Raichu. Almost all of his mons get one-shot. The rival fights are actually easier than the gym gauntlets because switching between different Pokemon avoids the issue, for lack of a better term, that we saw in Celadon Gym. It's not a marathon for a single Pokemon which can get chipped down. Every Pokemon is an answer for one of Dodo's and can exploit every weakness they have. As such, the sixth battle in Silphco is similarly easy, despite Dodo's team being pretty scary at this point. Alakazam with Psybeam, Disable, and Recover is intimidating on its own. Execute has Reflect and Stun Spore. Pidgeot has Quick Attack and even Whirlwind, which can cause problems but doesn't usually work. None of that mattered though, because I one-shot everything. The final battle before the Pokemon League is the same. Dodo's team is very scary at this point, but it just doesn't matter. My team has scaled into the stars and trounces everything he can throw at them. The rival battles are known for being significant challenges, but not when the game is played like this. Dodo was arguably the easiest part of the game, right up to the end, but we'll get to that.
So, if the rival is the easiest part of the game, what's the hardest?
Hey, what happened to your bike?
What happened to my bike? You happened to my bike, you little loser!
Everything in between. Overworld routes, caves, buildings, etc. They're all pretty long gauntlets where resource management becomes a very real issue. The regular routes usually just have a bunch of trainers and a couple of spots of grass or water for finding Pokemon. These can be annoying because the trainers and encounters whittle your team down and deplete their PP. At most points, it's fairly easy to run back to a Pokemon Center, but that takes a lot of time, especially because you move so dang slow in this game. I'm going to refer to everything in this next section as dungeons, just so it's easy to understand. This is any place that has you exploring a contained area, and most importantly, doesn't allow you to use fly or ride a bike. Viridian Forest is obviously meant to be easy, and it is. I found a Pikachu in my first encounter and caught it, a permanent member of my team. Mount Moon was actually pretty challenging for 2 reasons. 1, I was training Magikarp up, which was also a permanent member of my team. And 2, I didn't have any answers to Team Rocket's Pokemon. It's also a pretty long dungeon. In fact, it's the only time in the entire game that I blacked out. The SS Ann was very easy, and I used it to level Sandshrew up until I could give it a rare candy to evolve into Sandslash. Once again, a permanent member of my team. Diglett Cave exists, and by the time I got to Rock Cave, my team had scaled and there wasn't really any challenge. Gyarados decimated that dungeon. The Rocket Game Corner was very easy, even Giovanni at the end, 0 challenge. However, having to talk to a random trainer after the battle to get him to drop the lift key is very annoying and unnecessary. I was lost for quite a while because of this. The Pokemon Tower was another very easy gauntlet, but boy howdy was the inventory limit starting to get infuriating, especially because the game doesn't tell you what item is on the ground until you pick it up. Silphco was actually a bit challenging at times. It's very long, so health and PP were an issue, which is amplified by the strange type distribution of the trainers, making preparing for each battle a bit unpredictable. It's easy enough to run back to the Pokemon Center, especially after you find the card key, but I tried to limit that as much as I could throughout the playthrough. However, there is a checkpoint, for lack of a better term, that lets you heal up your team right before the rival fight and Giovanni again, which, despite having a pretty scary team, was incredibly easy. Again, my team just scales beyond what the game could throw at me. Got the Master Ball though. The Safari Zone isn't really a gauntlet, but it did finally convince me to start using the PC to store items. I never knew about the item storage when I was a kid, so I never used it, despite the fact that the game does a pretty good job teaching you about its existence by starting in a room with a PC and having a potion stored in there for you to withdraw. Smart design. The Safari Zone is very memorable, but I'm not super sold on its design as a whole, specifically the limit on steps. I know why it exists, but I kinda think it just wastes your time. Take a wrong turn or go for an item, you'll have to start over to get Surf. It's a small issue, but in a game with such slow movement speed, it's just a little irksome. They could have just stuck with the limited Safari Balls. The Seafoam Islands are one of the only dungeons that feel very puzzly to me. It took a while to figure out, and I think it's pretty well designed. I think strength is an interesting mechanic, but the implementation is a bit laborious, pun intended. There were a lot of random encounters, however, and eventually it just got annoying. On the upside, there were a lot of new Pokemon, including Articuno, which I caught in one try. That very much did not happen with Zapdos or Moltres.
The Pokemon Mansion follows the theme from Seafoam, with constant encounters and a bunch of new Pokemon. This is the point of the game that ticked me off, because I found a Magmar, a pretty rare encounter, but my box was full, so I wasn't allowed to catch it. The mansion itself wasn't super fun, but was easy. The trainers could be a little tough due to some weird type distribution, but that's minor. The place is definitely a maze, and it was cool to see the Mew lore.
The power plant was quick and easy. I was surprised to see it was all one floor. I tried catching Zapdos, but I kept missing, which meant the chance to catch it was so infinitesimally low that it didn't even play the animation. I decided to knock it out and move on, which I'm sure will make someone mad. Then we come to Victory Road, which is genuinely difficult. The random encounters are constant and high level, the trainers are actually hard due to not only having a wide type distribution amongst the group, but within individual battles as well. PP and health are a real issue and need frequent management. The puzzles are a little backtracky, but not too bad. Getting to Moltres was probably the most annoying part. By the way, I knocked Moltres out too. Sorry. And now, it's time. The Elite Four were always incredibly intimidating when I was a kid. It's such a long, grueling set of battles, and I struggled with them every time. Lorelai's Icy Team is designed to slow you down at every opportunity. Dugong has Growl to reduce your attack and Rest to heal up. Cloyster has Supersonic and can use Clamp to lock you down for multiple turns. Slowbro also has Growl, but has Withdraw as well, which increases its already high defense. Jinx can use Body Slam to paralyze you, or worse, Ice Punch to attempt a freeze. Finally, Lapras has Body Slam, Confuse Ray, and Blizzard. There's a lot of potential challenge here, but none of that mattered. Raichu swept. Bruno has another fierce team. He has 2 Onix with crazy defense and solid offense. Hitmonchan has incredible coverage with its elemental punches, and Hitmonlee is a glass cannon that will one-shot most of my team if given the chance. Then there's Machamp, and it has Fissure. That's a one-hit knockout on any of my Pokemon, assuming it hits. Venusaur took care of the Onix and Kadabra swept the fighting types. Oof. Agatha. Her team is a mess of status conditions and awkward typing. She has 2 Gengar, one with Hypnosis and the other with Toxic. They both have Confuse Ray. Her Golbat has Supersonic and Confuse Ray. Alright then. Her Haunter has Confuse Ray and Hypnosis, like the first Gengar, and her Arbok has Glare and Acid. This one took a little thinking, but Sandslash carried hard. I had to use Pidgeot, thinking it would faint so I could safely bring in Sandslash, but it got further than I thought it would. Sandslash's Earthquake took out everything other than Golbat, which Pidgeot handled. I used a full restore on Raichu just in case, but it didn't end up mattering. Lance is scary. A Gyarados, an Aerodactyl, 2 Dragonairs, and a Dragonite. Each Pokemon has an intense moveset, and they all know Hyper Beam, which is utterly broken in Red and Blue. It's a very powerful move, and as long as it knocks out the opponent, there's no recharge turn. Likely a bug. This one actually took some puzzle work, but I got it in one try. I started with Raichu to immediately take out Gyarados. I didn't have a great answer for the 2 Dragonair, so I decided to roll the dice and use Gyarados for Blizzard. Luckily it hit, but surprisingly it wasn't a one-shot. Lance used a Hyper Potion, so I instead used Dragon Rage and Bite to whittle it down, until Dragonair used Hyper Beam and knocked Gyarados out. I brought in Pidgeot to finish off the first one. I revived Gyarados, and Lance sent out the second Dragonair, and launched a Hyper Beam at Pidgeot. I was intending for Pidgeot to go down, but to my surprise, it survived. I used Fly to damage it as much as I could before Pidgeot went down. I brought in Kadabra to finish it off with Psychic. Lance sent out Aerodactyl, and I brought out Raichu. It nearly got one-shot by Hyper Beam. Thunderbolt nearly knocked Aerodactyl out, but Lance then used the Hyper Potion. My next Thunderbolt crit, however, and took out Aerodactyl from full health. Dragonite was up to bat last. Raichu used Thunder Wave to slow it down. It ended up getting paralyzed multiple times. Raichu spammed Thunder to damage it through barriers and a Hyper Potion, but eventually got knocked out. I brought in Gyarados and took a chance with Blizzard, which hit and the battle was over. This took some thinking, but I always had options in my back pocket. With that said, if Gyarados and Sandslash got knocked out after all that, I would have been in trouble, but that would have been a tall order for Lance. And the thing is, none of my Pokemon were even level 50 yet. I was dramatically underleveled. But here we are, the final battle with Champion Dodo. I've got a scary team, but so does he, and his is way above my level. This fight was tough. Just kidding, it was so easy. It required a bunch of switching, just like any other rival fight. There was a decent back and forth, but it wasn't a puzzle like Lance. Raichu took out Pidgeot, and Sandslash handled Alakazam, who used Recover on the first move for some reason. Venusaur handled Rhydon, and Pidgeot took on Exeggutor, which was the biggest challenge. Exeggutor has huge defense, and did a decent amount of damage. It put Pidgeot to sleep at one point, but I just used a full restore and whittled it down. Raichu stomped Dodo's Gyarados, while my Gyarados worked with Kadabra to take out Charizard. The only member of my team that got knocked out was Gyarados.
The Hall of Fame was super cool to see. Very nostalgic and satisfying. A nice ending. I'm really glad they kept this tradition throughout the years.
There's quite the valley of difficulty between the early game and the middle and late game. The game's difficulty, while limited, is front-loaded due to simply having more options and answers the further into the game you go. At no point did I have to grind, but I was strategic about which Pokemon I trained and when. I prepped Bulbasaur for Brock, Pikachu and Ivysaur for Misty, Sandslash for Lieutenant Surge, Pidgeotto for Erica, Kadabra for Koga, and I played the long game with Gyarados, which was the answer for so much later on. Side note, leveling Magikarp and Abra specifically had me thinking that I really missed the XP share from later games. It turns out that Red and Blue has the XP all once 50 Pokédex entries are filled. It's actually an example of really solid design, because by the time you unlock it, you've put in the work for training and catching various Pokemon, and it just helps level up lower level mons caught in the late game. I didn't know about this as a kid, because it's hidden behind talking to Professor Oak's aides, which you may not even encounter. Magikarp and Abra are special though, because having to grind through low levels of uselessness is part of their design. If you slog through it, they are extremely strong once they evolve. I have to wonder though, after I get through all the series up to the modern games, will I have a better appreciation for the XP share? It may very well just be better game design. We'll see. Aside from the annoying inventory limitations, I'm so glad this isn't a thing in future generations. The early game is much more difficult than the middle and late game. Here's the thing though. As a kid, I didn't have the game knowledge to crush the game into dust the way I did in this playthrough, and trust me, there are ways to further decimate this game far beyond what I chose to do. Any average kid wouldn't have had this game knowledge, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, when information on this stuff was so uncommon. Even something simple like obtaining Magikarp is something you need to either know or stumble upon, though it is intelligently implemented by placing the NPC right next to the PC. Red and Blue actually have brilliant game design, and its difficulty is part of that. Let's take Misty for example. Let's say you picked Charmander and don't have much of an answer to Misty's water-type Pokemon. You get frustrated and decide to go train in nearby grass patches. Sooner or later, you come across an Oddish in red or a Bellsprout in blue. Suddenly, you have an answer to Misty. The games reward exploration by introducing new Pokemon, finding items, and fighting trainers. There is always an answer to an upcoming challenge if you look for it, but it goes further than that. If you know what to look for, by the time you get to Cerulean City, it's completely reasonable to have a team that will serve you for the rest of the game. Each Pokemon can have answers to multiple types, and that gives you the opportunity to train them up throughout the game to stomp the middle and late game as I did. But this can only happen if you have solid game knowledge or you explore. I didn't go into the game with a specific team in mind, but I did so wanting to form my team before the mid-game, and I found it was easy to do with the game knowledge I have. So while Pokemon Red and Blue are much easier than I remember, and they're probably easier than you remember as well, that doesn't mean there isn't a decent amount of challenge for an inexperienced player. But the game supports that inexperienced player by encouraging exploration and having strategically placed answers scattered throughout the game world.
At this point, there was only one thing left to do. I headed over to Cerulean Cave, which is filled with very rare Pokemon that are high level and tough to catch. I find my way to Mewtwo and use a Master Ball, just as I always did as a kid.
I've talked so much about difficulty and battle mechanics, but everyone knows Pokemon is so much more than that. Battling is only part of the package. Catching is the main draw. Masahiro Sakurai of Kirby and Smash Bros. Fame, among others, defines this as the game's push or pull. Battling is the major push that puts resistance against the player. Catching is the major pull that keeps the player moving toward their goals, and eventually becomes the entire goal for anyone trying to complete the Pokédex. This push and pull was the spark that started the entire Pokemon phenomenon, because you can't catch every Pokemon yourself. Well, unless you have 2 Game Boys, a copy of both Red and Blue, and a link cable. Then you have to play all the way through both games. completing the Pokédex isn't meant to be done alone. It's a community effort, a brilliant one at that, because it doubles as a devilishly effective marketing strategy. And it's all because Satoshi Tajiri, the series creator, was frustrated with a Dragon Quest game. Let's do a thought experiment real quick. What if Pocket Monsters Red and Green in Japan had come out on the SNES instead of the Game Boy? If that had happened, there would have been no way to interact with other players of the games, no trading and no battling. Would the series have spread like wildfire the way it did? Probably not. Would it even have made its way to the West? It's entirely possible that it wouldn't have. The decision to develop the games for the Game Boy was made by Tajiri due to access to link cable functionality. He remembered being frustrated with Dragon Quest II, Luminaries of the Legendary Line, due to how rare a specific item drop is from a small handful of monsters. He wished he could trade for that item, but it wasn't possible because the NES didn't have the ability to share data. That's why we have trading and battling in Pokemon games. To be honest, I always assumed it was a shrewd decision by Nintendo to market the games and series like crazy, but it seems it originated from a place of pure design theory, though it was Shigeru Miyamoto himself who suggested different Pokemon be on separate cartridges. Though to be fair, I think that's actually pretty important to the experience at this point. In fact, Tajiri didn't even really know what he had. He actually thought Nintendo would reject his idea altogether. Can you imagine that? A world without Pokemon. Nintendo, however, at least had an idea and helped form Creatures Inc. to assist with development and franchise management. The three companies in Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures would later become the Pokemon Company.
Satoshi Tajiri truly thought that Nintendo would shoot down the idea. Instead, he just casually created the single most profitable franchise of all time. Casually is in heavy quotation marks because Red and Green were very serious projects and were likely the last gasp in an otherwise failing Game Freak. And the games actually took 6 years to develop due to how complex they were.
Speaking of complexity, I would be remiss not to mention the spaghetti code because it's a miracle that these games exist. It's crazy how such a complex world with so many different Pokemon, moves, and items was able to work on a Game Boy with such a small amount of data and memory. But it has a crazy number of bugs and glitches. Everything from the infamous missing no allowing you to duplicate any item to weird interactions like Growlithe acting as a Thunderstone. And it's always funny to me that Mew was supposed to be available only if you attended a specific event. Yet, anybody can catch Mew on any copy of Red or Blue, and it's really not hard. Thankfully, the glitches are mostly harmless and generally don't do damage to your save file, but they certainly can if you're not careful. I'm not going to talk anymore about the glitches because they've been covered so many times before. Listen, the games aren't perfect. There's balance issues, it's often unclear what you need to do to progress, and sometimes straight up obscure. The inventory limit, which likely had to do with the aforementioned spaghetti code, is infuriating, and the way boxes are handled for Pokemon can sting at the wrong moment. But my personal biggest complaint is just how slow you move, though the bike does help. But these games really are brilliantly designed, and they deserve respect. They were the beginning of the absolute titan that is Pokemon after all, and that core design is still present to this day. It lends the games incredible replayability and makes it easy to take part in self-imposed challenge runs. This core design is why Scarlet and Violet are such fun games despite their many issues, especially at launch.
Pokémon Red and Blue are superb, and they absolutely deserve that decades-old 10 out of 10.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video! Let me know what the hardest part of the original Pokemon games were for you in the comments, and please consider subscribing if you enjoyed this. On screen is another analysis video, and another video that you might like. Thanks so much for watching.